Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem studio. Jonathan, our regular host, is away. We'll be back soon. Some 4 months after President Donald Trump revoked Washington's participation in the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran and reimposed economic sanctions on the regime in Tehran, Iran is struggling to cope with this challenge and to cooperate with European and Asian powers to withstand the American pressure. To analyze this topic, our panel today includes Dr. Eldad Pardo, Research Director at Impact SE and lecturer on Iran at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Ms. Paula Slier, TV7 Analyst, Dr. Elisheva, Machlis, lecturer on Middle Eastern and Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and Dr. Efraim at INSS. Dr. Pardo, let me put it in a very simple way. Is it win, lose, or draw for Iran the way the game is played right now?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I think from the real perspective of Iran, it's a win because what the Iranians need, because of their ideology that requires to take over the world and prepare it for the Mahdi and be ready for the world war and all of that, they need some structure and consequences. And I think the American policy gives them that structure and policy. Very interestingly, since the May declaration, we've seen a lot of discourse inside Iran. What about the economy? What about corruption? What about our inside relations? Of course, there is a lot of scapegoating and they attack the wrong people and all of that. Also, we heard from Khamenei, the old man who wants to give some inheritance to the next generation, that he does not see war in the cards, and he also would not like, at the moment, to negotiate with the Americans. And most importantly, they are still committed to this deal that Khamenei himself said that actually never happened because the Americans didn't sign, and now they want to have assurances. So what we see is a kind of a recalibrating of the entire Iranian position, which may, in the end of the day, be very good for the revolution and the Islamic regime in the long run. More realistic approach, less nuclear, less imperialism, to behave according to their real size and power.
But if we put it in personal terms, President Trump versus the Supreme Leader Khamenei, and they are tweeting and counter-tweeting. One of Khamenei's tweets, which you referred to, said, "No war, but no negotiations." And he also said that the Americans don't know the meaning of the term face, that the Obama administration was not so good either, but at least they didn't cause Iran to lose face. What can one learn from it regarding the mandate that Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and others get in order to renegotiate?
Well, what we saw is that the American side, they kind of exposed the Iranian bluff. Iran needs this deal. Iran is not a kind of a isolated state like North Korea or, whatever kind of dictatorship as Albania used to be. It's a very sophisticated, large country with many cities, thousands of universities, intellectuals, industry, relations, and they could have been right now in history, they could have been a leading country technologically, culturally, from many, many aspects, and they just miss everything, and their main weakness is that there is inside enough open discourse to understand it. It's not that, everybody just say yes, yes, yes. No, people understand. And gradually, it's very difficult for people to give up their perks, to give up their dreams. They were thinking, their expectations were so high 2-3 years ago. They were sure that they are going to conquer Mecca and Medina, to encircle Israel, to have nuclear weapons, and with this deal that was worth nothing, also to have all the money and more of that real estate. They destroyed the Arab world. They bought land, and now they want to restructure the Arab world after they bought all this. So this is a lot of money. So this means that they plan to keep the dictatorship by an economy that is based on stealing from the other, on selling oil, and avoiding the economic openness that is needed for real development. On the way, they destroyed the environment, they destroyed everything inside, so they cannot continue, and I think they will, they may jump over the cliff as they did in 1941, 1979, 1953. There were cases in Iranian history that they went all the way to the end of the cliff and jumped. I believe that Khamenei, I'm a Khamenei fan, I believe he will not do it. I think he's smarter.
Ms. Slier, you've been privy to Russian thinking, you've been to Moscow recently, and obviously the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a multi-party deal. It is not the Americans vis-à-vis the Iranians. There are also the three European powers, China, Russia, as well as the EU. Are the Russians going to help Iran withstand the American pressure because of their global considerations, not necessarily only because of their relationship with Tehran?
Well, Russia did not want to see the deal end. If you remember back in 2015 when the deal was signed, there were still sanctions that were imposed on Western companies who were not allowed to come and do business inside Iran. But Russian companies were able to flourish in that environment. It didn't affect them in the same way. So now when you have further sanctions entrenched, it doesn't automatically mean that the Russians are able to do a whole lot of business inside Iran. You're likely to see cooperation continuing, of course, but you'll have mostly small projects between the sides. What the Russians are most concerned about is politically, what does this mean? Because on the one hand, you have Iran, which is just on the periphery of post-Soviet space. Now, any kind of disruption there, any kind of tension there could have implications and will be felt by Moscow. So they're a bit concerned about it from that point of view. But they have a relationship with Iran that goes back years and years. It's a relationship that on the one hand is positive, but of course the two have always been on certain issues at odds with each other. It also puts Russia in a difficult position in terms of its international standing and where does it 100% posit itself. Although it's with the Iranians, it's not completely with the Iranians, and it doesn't necessarily want to ire up the anger of the Americans. So I think Russia at the moment would have preferred the deal to have continued, and they certainly would like to see it survive. Russia is one of the options, as you mentioned, so is the Europeans and the Asians, in terms of trying to reinforce what the Iranians have lost and what the deal has lost by the withdrawal of the American president.
Perhaps trying to read too much into President Trump's mind is not fair. But when he came into office during the election campaign and even later, he spoke about his wish for good relations with Putin personally, with Russia, and said this is a good thing, this is not a bad thing. Wasn't that part of a grand design to have this spat with Iran, but have Russia on his side for the struggle over the fate of the Iranian nuclear deal?
Russia's not going to be so quick to give up past alliances and past friendships. It's not that the Russians are suddenly going to throw Iran to the dogs. Russia is, in a way, caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place. They certainly want to see improved relations with the Americans, but not everything is so rosy on that score either. And particularly with the allegations of Russians' interference in the American electoral system, the Russians have to be careful as well, not to be seen to be too close to President Trump for their own concerns. And they also seem to be a little bit disappointed with the American president on some levels. They would have preferred a relationship that was much closer, and there certainly was expectation that it would be. But we need to wait and see exactly how the relationship formulates itself, and I don't think the Russians want to be used as a tool by the Americans vis-a-vis Iran.
Dr. Kam, is there any effect so far following what is happening on the American-Iranian plane on the Iranian involvement in Syria, their plans for rearming the Syrian military, the news which were leaked by the American administration to Fox News, a very friendly network, regarding commercial flights by Iranian airliners into Syria of material. Are we seeing any impact so far of the Revolutionary Guards being hampered in their efforts to operate in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen?
I believe that Iranian military intervention in Syria, it was a mistake. And I think they feel now that how bad mistake it was. First of all, they cannot fight against Israeli forces. They are far away from home. They have to operate forces more than 1,000 kilometers from the Iranian territory. And they are inferior compared to the Israeli side. Especially there, Israel is using its air force, air attacks. The Iranian air force does not appear on this arena. And for good reason, because had it tried to compete with the Israeli Air Force, it would be defeated.
Do they even want the Iranian Air Force as part of the regular Iranian military, as distinct from the Revolutionary Guards? Do they even want to help the Revolutionary Guards encroach in Syria?
I'm doubtful, because it is a weak Air Force in terms of the obsolete aircraft, in terms of training, in terms of operations. It's going to be defeated if it tries to appear in the Syrian arena. So the Air Force, Israeli Air Force is acting almost without any challenge. And the Iranians don't have any solution to this problem. And this is part of the larger problem. What are they going to do, not only with Syria, what are they going to do with this situation in which the pressure of President Trump, it doesn't give them any solution. I think about maybe 3 options for them, how to get out from this bad situation, which they are now. One, to continue what it has done so far, which means to try to continue with the agreement with Europeans, with Asians, member of the agreement, and maybe someday it will bring to better situation. They can wait, maybe with some kind of hope that President Trump will leave the White House sooner or later. But there is no guarantee that it's going to happen in the foreseeable future. Secondly, they can decide to do what they are doing, what they are saying, to threaten that they are going to go back to the nuclear activities before the agreement was concluded. The meaning is that they are going to face new sanctions on the part of the Americans and the Europeans, and the Europeans won't stay with them if they are going to violate the agreement. And third, to try to negotiate a new agreement. Until now, they said there is no, they rejected altogether this option. And for good reason, because this is not minor changes. This is really the heart of the agreement. Take the 12 demands or conditions of Pompeo, of Secretary Pompeo. Take what Trump is telling them. These are very, very difficult demands, and I think they cannot accept them. It is not in the emergence of the agreement, the heart of the agreement.
Dr. Machlis, we hear daily reports of further devaluation in the Iranian currency as against the dollar. And we also hear of the domestic dispute with President Rouhani having to face his parliament to answer charges. What is the upshot? Have the moderates, the relative moderates, gained or lost because of what has happened in the last several months?
Well, it's not only that the president had to answer to the parliament, the Machlis. There were 2 of his ministers that were lately sacked. One is the finance minister, the labor minister. So there's a lot of pressure on Rouhani, and perhaps he will become a scapegoat, that the pressure will be on him. He will pay the price for the current situation. So I see a situation in which the moderate forces, or the relative moderate forces represented by Rouhani, known as the more realist faction in Iran, will actually lose from the current situation, because that would be just the easier way around. So we might see actually the radicalization of politics in Iran, and the strengthening of the more radical forces as a result.
But there were hopes earlier of more demonstrations, more opposition coalescing against the regime. We haven't seen it so far. Neither have we seen some support for the regime against foreign intervention. It almost seems business as usual.
Well, I think the demonstrations were significant, although this wasn't a real threat to the regime. I think the demonstration was significant because, first of all, they cut across the different social factions. They cut across different social groups in Iran. We saw a demonstration in the bazaar, which represents the middle class or the lower middle class. We saw more moderate forces join, but we also saw demonstrations in the more religious cities. I think the demonstrations are a problem for the Iranian regimes, although it's not a threat. But this is a problem because this undermines the legitimacy of the regime. And the regime can't allow itself to have demonstration go on too long. On the other hand, it's also an opportunity perhaps to let out steam to a certain, but I think the big issue is that we don't have an opposition yet that's united. So we have various forces that are representing their grievances, but we still don't have a very strong opposition against the regime.
Dr. Pardo, is there anyone in the Iranian intellectual elite, not in the regime itself, but in the elite, people who think in academia or in other such places, with some strategic vision for Iran, not some tactical maneuver regarding what Trump is doing today or how do we get a better deal, but what's the long-range plan for Iran for the next decade or after Khamenei?
Okay, I just want to short points. One is that I study revolutions for many, many years, and the end of the game is that you cannot know. Revolutions are multi-factor events, and nobody can predict them, including the revolutionaries. Even if you win a revolution, it's usually by chance. It's something that Khamenei, by the way, he is a great scholar on revolutions. He participated in a revolution, he scuttled a number of revolutions, and he reads everything that is published on revolution. He is a very well-read person. So he knows that his regime can collapse any minute under these circumstances, regardless of all the, everybody, including myself, say, no, it's not unlikely, but you cannot be sure. What I see with him is maneuvering of the first class. It's my wishful thinking. I see that he talked to the people in a way, truth. He says our problems are not the sanctions, our problems are us. And that's why you have all this scapegoating. But I think realistically, because Khamenei is so powerful, that the status of Rouhani will not be harmed, but just the opposite. It turns out it's pretty clear that he is the only one who can save this revolution. Maybe maybe it's kind of wishful thinking or something. Maybe it's not the case. As for intellectuals, I would like to quote only the cultural intellectual Sadegh Zibah Kalam, who is from University of Tehran, a historian, and he speaks all the time. He's pro-democracy, very, very staunch pro-democracy, but he argues that everyone should help the regime because there is no easy way to democracy for Iran. Any change, even if there is an agreement, there is so much hate among various parts of society, Persian, non-Persians, and so on, that the best thing for Iran is to keep the regime and gradually change it. And that's, I think, I'm not happy to admit it, but I think he's right. I think what is best for Iran, definitely not for us, is that this regime will stay, but will be forced to change under a lot of pressure. And this is what is happening. So it can either explode or implode, or they might understand that simply that there is no other way.
Has there ever been a period of democracy in Iran, except perhaps for the very short period of Bani Sadr and Bazargan between the Shah and the full revolutionary spirit of Khomeini? It doesn't seem to be any possibility for Iran to have a democracy.
Okay, I would like to quote David Menashri. I tend to read his analysis from the past. He predicted pretty good in the past also. So he said that there is no other people in the Middle East that struggle so hard for freedom and democracy. On the other hand, when you read Iranian scholars, they write about themselves, they say that the Iranians don't have the talent for democracy because they are overly individualistic, and they even admitted the Arabs are more democratic than themselves. So they have very good image of themselves as intellectuals, creators, and empire builders, everything, scientists, but not as political scientists in making democracies. And I think they are right.
It sounds like the old saying about Israel with 8 million prime ministers.
Yeah.
In Iran, there are 80 million
something like that.
supreme leaders. Ms. Slier, President Trump has alienated his allies in Europe because of his policy towards Iran. Do you think that Germany, France, and Britain, especially Germany and France, can go on for long with their policy of trying to counter Trump and to subsidize business deals with Iran in order to compensate for the sanctions which are going to be imposed on European companies doing business with Iran?
No, I don't think so. And I mean, we've heard from Germany as such saying that, well, we just don't have the financial means to make up for the economic fallout that America withdrawing from the deal is going to have. There were a few other points I wanted to make in the sense that I think this is very important for Trump. I think Trump needs to make a point by having pulled out of the deal. And I think if one keeps an eye on what's happening with North Korea as an aside, it will be interesting for the Iranians to see if Trump is able to have a success vis-a-vis North Korea. It might give them a way of responding or knowing how to respond. So I think that's one important thing on the side. The other is the day after. I mean, you were talking here about what's going to happen in the future, but when I talk to Iranians who live outside of Iran and who are very involved, their biggest concern is that the economy is literally on the brink of collapse. And the day after for Iranians, it's all very well to have a regime change, but how is the ordinary person actually going to survive? And how is the ordinary person going to make sure that they can put food on their table? So this is something that, you know, amongst all our analysis and discussions, one needs to be very cognizant of what this actually means vis-a-vis ordinary people in Iran getting by.
Dr. Machlis, we haven't heard lately about Israel being the little Satan. It's all about the Americans versus the Iranians. A few months ago, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed the lifting of the atomic archive from Tehran, thereby putting Israel back center stage regarding Iran. But this was an isolated instance, and I'm not talking right now about what is happening in Syria, the clashes between Israel and Iranian forces. But in the larger scheme of things, what place does Israel have now in Iran?
Well, I think the fact that the Israeli card hasn't been used yet doesn't mean it won't be used. I think still in Iran, the view is of opposition to what's known as imperialist forces, and in that respect, Israel is still the little Satan. So I think that card can be used and will be used when needed. I don't think there's any change in how the Iranian regime views Israel. We also have to remember that in Iran today, there's a combination of both an Islamic regime, but also a very nationalist regime. And the fact that we have the revolutionary forces involved in other countries such as Syria, Iraq, this just strengthens this nationalist tendency. So I think the fact that Israel hasn't been mentioned, I don't think this is any kind of sign that there is a change in the view towards Israel.
Dr. Kam, ironically enough, because President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu seem to be on the same wavelength, Israel's leverage in Washington is less than what it used to be during the Obama administration, when Netanyahu presented another point of view and tried to gain support in the party out of power, which used to be the Republic.
I don't think so. I think that
What's
Israel's position is stronger than ever before in Washington. Trump is listening to the Israeli advices or opinions with regard to what happens, what happens in Iran. And I think, well, he didn't tell me, of course, but I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is quite happy with what's happening, first of all, to Iran, and secondly, to the Trump policy vis-à-vis Iran. Because everything has been changed since then. As I said before, Iran is in a very bad situation with regard to the nuclear issue, with regard to what happens now in Syria. And both of these issues are affecting the domestic arena in Iran. And I think, coming back to the question of the domestic arena, I believe for many years that sometime in the future, and I cannot say when, the regime in Iran will change. Not dramatically, perhaps, not going back to the Shah days, not necessarily becoming a democracy, but it's going to change in the sense of the nature of this regime, in the sense of related to the people. And I'm saying that for one simple reason, because millions of Iranians, not thousands, millions of Iranians want a different kind of regime, a different kind of Islamic republic, more liberal, less corrupt, improving the economy. And what is happening now in the street is not enough. It's not enough. But this could be the beginning. I remember the days of the revolution against the Shah. It started with this kind of demonstration in the streets. And when I hear 9 years ago, the first shout of death to the traitor. The traitor was Khamenei. And now we hear the death to Syria, death to Palestine. These are the cornerstone of the Iranian policy.
Thank you, Dr. Kam. In 20 seconds or less, Dr. Pardo, the next mark is going to be in 2 months' time, early November, when more sanctions are going to be reimposed. Will Iran survive the next batch of sanctions?
It's very hard to tell. If they take advantage of the emergency as they are used to, and they really try to create an emergency situation inside while convincing the people that it's worthwhile fighting, then they can survive. But the problem is, Dr. Kam really hit it on the nail, that the Iranian people lost faith. And here enters the qismat, the destiny.
Thank you. Ms. Slier, in 10 seconds or less?
I think that it poses a real problem, but I think they will survive. I think they'll continue to put pressure on Europe and on Asia and on Russia and say to them, you need to make sure that this deal works.
Dr. Machlis?
I think so far there's a draw. Iran knows how to survive. Iran embraces what's known as the resistance economy and resistance to any forces. So Iran knows how to survive.
Thank you all, Dr. Pardo, Ms. Slier, Dr. Machlis, and Dr. Kam. And we will see you next time. Shalom from Jerusalem.
TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.